The Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered at his country's consulate in Istanbul on the 2nd of October. Initially, the government in Riyadh giving contradictory explanations for his disappearance. The kingdom's young ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS for short, must now deal with mounting pressure from some key Western allies. Very good to have your company on this roundtable. I'm David Foster. It has been one of the biggest political stroke criminal scandals in recent years. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi has drawn in countries and political leaders around the world. In the European Union, there's been no agreement on how to respond to Saudi Arabia's handling of the killing.
Germany was the first EU state to ban arms sales to Saudi Arabia after Jamal Khashoggi's killing. But the move will only affect future orders to what is the country's second biggest market for weapons. Berlin has banned from the Schengen area 18 Saudis allegedly behind the killing. France and Britain have much deeper and lucrative trading relations with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia bought more than $12 billion in French arms from 2008 to 2017. Macron dismissed calls from fellow EU leaders to ban arms to the kingdom as demagoguery. So with such divergence between Paris and Berlin, can the EU ever hope to achieve a unified stance on Mohammed bin Salman?
Okay, let's get the conversation going. At the round table today, Andreas Krieg, Middle Eastern defence expert. We have Dr. Ian Black from the London School of Economics and former Middle East editor of The Guardian. And making up the trio, James Rogers, Director of the Global Britain Programme at the Henry Jackson Society in London. We're talking here about the European response to Khashoggi's killing. But when it comes to a unified Europe, are we really only talking about a number of particularly strong countries?
Yes, I think the big three when it comes to arms sales particularly are Germany, France and the UK. All three of them have different foreign policies towards the Gulf. All three of them have different interests that entangled in the whole, not just the Khashoggi affair, but also particularly Saudi's involvement in Yemen. So their reasoning for dealing with Mohammed bin Salman are different. And I think all three of them divert. That's why they divert on how to move forward.
All right, let's talk about Germany, because it was mentioned just there in the introduction about the fact that they want to ban arms sales. Well, we're talking about future arms sales, particularly with Germany. But there is a division of opinion within Germany about the state of mind, even, of Mohammed bin Salman.
There's a famous story about a report commissioned by the German intelligence service, the BND, into bin Salman's state of mind. Now, like a lot to do with this story, we don't know how true it is. It was clearly leaked, but since bin Salman became the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, he has attracted a huge amount of attention and, of course, concern, which has been aggravated by to put it mildly, by the Khashoggi affair. So people are very interested in how it works, how he reaches decisions, the people around him. We've seen some light shed on that. So the German report is part of...
And let's be blunt about it. The German report seemed to indicate that they thought he was unstable.
A lot has been said about him. Saudis tend to speak privately about this rather than publicly, and especially since, of course, what happened to Khashoggi. He's an incredibly powerful figure who has consolidated his position since he became Crown Prince. Before that, of course, he was Deputy Crown Prince and Defence Minister and played a key role in the war in Yemen, which is another significant part of international attention.
Perhaps we can get onto that in a little while, but let's talk about the German assessment of Mohammed bin Salman. Is this a view shared right the way across the German establishment, or just amongst the intelligence community, and perhaps not shared by Angela Merkel, or maybe it is?
Well, it seems that it's shared by the intelligence community, but I'm not sure whether it's shared by the wider German establishment, and I'm not sure that it's shared by the wider European group of countries as well. I think they all have slightly different approaches on this, as the first speaker said.
Okay, but in terms of the approach, how will this assessment of his character determine what the Germans do? Are they playing with eggshells here?
Well, I mean, I've been to Berlin quite a lot over the last 2 months since the affair broke out. And so the conversations I have with people in the foreign ministry also depend on who you speak to. So there's one chunk of people. I mean, we probably have to generally say that the attitude towards Saudi Arabia and Germany is very negative or large. I mean, I think most people are quite critical of Saudi Arabia. They question the nature of that relationship. But there have been quite a lot of people recently saying, actually, Mohammed bin Salman is someone who can break the ice of basically idleness and lack of progress that we've been experiencing over the last 80 years. So maybe we should give him a chance. And there's been a lot of lobbying around that. So it's really, it comes down to how evil is he? Yes. And how much has he been involved? Yes. But then again, there is also this pragmatist view in Germany where people are saying maybe he's the only one who actually can break the stalemate and move the country forward.
Would you agree with this, James, that perhaps he is the best hope for the future, or he was certainly seen as such, but now in light of the Khashoggi affair, there are more open concerns?
Well, I think certainly there are more open concerns, and I'm not sure how this does well for Saudi Arabia's wider reputation in the major Western powers within Europe, particularly the UK, Germany, France. And I think increasing questions will be asked about this in relation to his stability to lead, and the future direction of Saudi Arabia as well.
But Germany's not going to put any pressure, is it, on people to sort of say, to sideline this man and other areas in Saudi Arabia to take him out of the picture?
I think if you look at the international responses to the Khashoggi affair, you see from very early on, in its most extreme form in President Donald Trump, but actually reflected elsewhere, I don't think that many governments around the world imagine that the response to the Khashoggi affair will include a significant change in the power structure of Saudi Arabia. They accept that you can't really do much about that. And I think that, in general terms, I also think you're exaggerating the importance of Germany in this story, if I may say so. I think that Britain and France are more important.
Well, I'm not going to leave them out, Ian. I just wanted to start with somebody who seemed to have an opposite opinion to the way that Britain and France behave.
But the German role has attracted a lot of attention. Yeah. It's worth pointing out it was immediately criticised by Emmanuel Macron, the French president, as populist demagoguery, making a clear distinction between whatever criminal activity or human rights breaches had taken place in the Khashoggi affair and the interests of states in maintaining their normal relations. And that business as usual argument, I think, is the dominant theme.
So Macron has said we have to have a unified response. He's basically said, let's get real about this. We make an awful lot of money from Saudi Arabia. Is he right? Do Britain and France in particular need to continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia? What would happen if they said no?
Well, if we look at the widest imports of Saudi Arabia, weapons imports, the most important provider is and remains the United States, and will continue to be so in the future. Britain comes second, but the share that Britain has is even in terms of percentage. If we look at the 110 billion that were pledged by the Saudis over the next 10 years, looking at Britain was just about 2 billion last year, which is a good year for British sales into Saudi Arabia. Still a small chunk of what the Saudis are buying from America, and then France comes after that, and Germany comes after that. So there's a lot of fluctuation in the way that the Saudis import arms from Europe. So Europe is important, but Saudi is not going to stop fighting the war in Yemen or stop going to do anything on the ground just because the Europeans are deciding not to sell arms anymore.
But is this a fact? I mean, I know they get the hardware. If they order some planes, they get the planes. If they order anti-ballistic missiles, they get that kind of weaponry. But they don't need it. They dump it. They leave it in the desert. So effectively, they are paying Britain, France, or whoever else it happens to be, just to keep nice.
There's an argument that was set out in a report in the US just the other day that President Trump is wildly exaggerating the significance of what he described as the upcoming arms deals with the Saudis. The figure of, I think, $110 billion was forensically taken apart and shown to be far, far smaller in reality. Ditto the argument about the number of American jobs that rely on it. There is almost a knee-jerk reaction to defend these things, whereas I think what is at stake is a far broader strategic relationship that isn't just about arms sales. Saudi Arabia is the most important Arab ally of the United States at a time when President Trump has embarked on an extremely confrontational strategy opposed by all Europeans against Iran. So I think you've got to look at the wider picture to understand just why Trump in particular is rushing to defend what he called a steadfast ally just the other day, ignoring the findings of his own intelligence.
So what are we going to see from Europe, if anything? Any suggestion of, as Macron puts it, you know, this joint approach, this unified response?
Well, the idea, I think, among the major European powers is that there will be greater coordination between the three, and I think this is probably also, to some extent, a British perspective as well, in relation to the withdrawal from the European Union, so that there will be greater coordination between Britain, France and Germany in the place of European Union coordination, although that may, of course, still take place under French and German leadership. But I think from a British angle, there will be a greater desire to see this coordination. Now, whether or not it will be effective is another thing entirely. We've seen Europeans trying to shape politics in Ukraine and Syria, around the northern hinterland of Africa, but the actual success that they've had has been rather limited because they simply lack the means, and I think also to some extent the will, to actually make a difference and to understand what their interests actually are.
Well, the strongest European statement, if I may say so, I completely agree with James, the strongest European statement on the Khashoggi affair came from what used to be called the E3, that's Britain, France and Germany, and that fits in with the, in my view, very sad story of Britain leaving the European Union, but still trying to assert its weight on the continent with its two most powerful allies who are still within the EU. The European Union, in the form of Federica Mogherini, the High Representative for Foreign Policy, has issued a statement too, but the attention was, I think, caught much more by the British, French, German statement.
Has the murder, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, has it actually been rather awkward for the big three in Europe? Because it actually focuses on the dichotomy they have when it comes to dealing with Saudi Arabia.
Not really. I mean, look, we always focus, I think most of the media attention internationally was on the Trump administration, how they dealt with it, how bluntly he said it was all about interests, it's not about values. But my argument is Europe is not much different when it comes to that. And they're always saying as well, I mean, you know, it's a balancing act between our economic interest and our values. The difference here is, and we should say that when we talk about Germany, the fact that Germany has now been somewhat making a U-turn is that they at the moment have no MOUs signed, memorandums
of understanding. In other words, no deals.
No outstanding deals, so it's an easy choice to make. For France, it's a more difficult choice because there are deals in the making, and the same is true for Britain post-Brexit. Britain needs these kind of contracts. They secure jobs in the UK. So the argument from an interest point of view is a different one for the UK and France, and Germany right now has a bit of a luxury of saying, oh yeah, we are able to do it, but then look at previous years. You know, the Germans have sold quite massively.
So more embarrassing for the big three in Europe, if you like, or the big 2+1. I don't know how you would want to phrase it, with Britain's Brexit coming up. More embarrassing for them than perhaps for Saudi Arabia, in a strange way?
I think it's been enormously damaging to Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think we can't just dismiss that. I mean, really interesting. I think just today, Mohammed bin Salman is visiting Tunisia. Interesting. Why Tunisia? Why do I single that out? Tunisia is arguably the only country where what we used to call the Arab Spring had any sort of success at all. There are demonstrations in Tunisia against him. That's not going to happen, I think, in any other Arab country at all. So actually you have a reflection of significant political change in one country which doesn't accept the broader consensus of all Arab governments that this man is beyond criticism.
But discomforting for Saudi Arabia. Where does the long-term damage, as you referred to it,
and we have an increasing British and French commitment to the security of the Gulf in relation to Bahrain, the UAE, Oman, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, we have a desire to see political change in many of the region's countries. And you can add to that the movement of Russia and China into the region as well. And it makes an already a powder keg increasingly combustible.
I suppose what I'm trying to drive at is anything really going to change?
No. But here's another thing. We talk about Khashoggi, and yes, it is a tragedy, but there's this whole debate of, 1,000 of people dying in Yemen. It's statistics, and this is a particular tragedy. Let's look at how France...
But I sort of understand that, because this actually was a focus on one particular person who was relatively well known, which in turn then refocused the light, albeit temporarily, on what is happening in Yemen. So I didn't get this idea that we shouldn't be talking about that. This is what we should be talking about.
I think we shouldn't forget that France and Britain are very much engaged in this war in Yemen. They are providing strategic, operational, and sometimes tactical support. The French are providing naval support for the UAE. I mean, for them, they are complicit in that war, i.e. they couldn't be as hypocritical and actually criticizing. They're trying to, but standing out there and say, oh, we don't want you to do that anymore. So I think that is something we need to factor in.
Go on. Say whatever you want to say. Then I've got a slightly sort of off-beam thought.
I think that there are signs, and there were signs before the Khashoggi Affair, that the British, French, and the American attitude towards the war in Yemen was starting to change. I mean, it's important to point out that there is a UN resolution that authorized the Saudi-led coalition to intervene in Yemen. Okay, now. The rising international awareness about the dimensions of the looming and existent humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen have focused attention on it. So we've seen the Americans, for example, already stop their refueling of coalition aircraft, have we not? We've seen public opinion, I think, in this country as well, turn increasingly against the war in Yemen. The Khashoggi Affair focused attention in a very, very stark and dramatic way on the wider question of Saudi Arabia. Bin Salman has concocted and sold a narrative of himself as a modernizer, as a reformist who has allowed women to drive, who is going to wean the Saudis off their decades-long dependence on oil. There are vast investment opportunities internationally, including for many Western countries as well, European ones too. That is what is at stake.
Was Britain, and by extension perhaps other countries in Europe, reminded of the indebtedness it has, in a sense, to Saudi Arabia by the jailing by a Saudi proxy in the United Arab Emirates of this supposed MI6 agent? Was Britain reminded then that these countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE in this case, can act and can hurt and is still prepared to do so?
Well, I think to some extent, yes. I mean, the other issue is look at Saudi Arabia's defense budget. Over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, it's increased to something like $87 billion US. It's consuming around 11% of the Saudi GDP. So in some ways, the strategic situation in the region has been offshored to Saudi Arabia. Now, the major Western powers, the US, the UK, France, Germany, need to ask themselves whether this is actually a viable strategy in the long run, because otherwise it will have other implications that we're now beginning to see as decisions are taken that are not going to play well in Western public opinion.
The UAE is an extremely important ally for Saudi Arabia. When bin Salman embarked on his regional tour, which has taken him to Tunisia today, his first stop was in Abu Dhabi. Mohammed bin Zayed, the effective ruler of Abu Dhabi, is a close and important mentor for bin Salman. I think you're right. I think that the effect of the Matthew Hedges affair was to remind people that in this part of the world they are important partners, allies, sources of investment, wonderful holidays in Dubai, but they also are
and perhaps,
autocratic systems.
Yeah, more importantly, if we have to choose between our friends, Saudi's more of our friend than you, Britain, are our friend, and this is how we're showing it. Yes, okay, we'll let Mr. Hedges go at the end of the day, but we're really sort of demonstrating that we have some clout.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reality check there. I mean, this master-slave relationship that might have existed in the 60s and 70s with Britain as a former colonial power and the Gulf has definitely changed, and I think the Emiratis are pushing the envelope, trying to probe how far they can go, and I think Matthew Hedges was part of it, but it was also a statement of a country punching above its weight, but also a country that has a lot more confidence. They are dictating,
and doing so because it knows that Saudi is alongside it.
Yes, also because Saudi is alongside it, but it gives them the leverage that the UAE have in Libya, in Egypt, in Yemen, in the Horn of Africa, means that if Britain wants to do anything in this area, it has to go via the UAE, and there is a realization why I told that this is the case.
So let's go one stage further and talk about the UAE's attitude, or Saudi Arabia's attitude, one and the same or not, towards the European Union when it comes to strategic partners and the United States, because the hints have been dropped that Russia, China are actually going to be probably a bit more important to us, that part of the world, than our old allies and friends.
And that takes us back to the Cold War in a way, because we were balancing this issue back then. How do we deal with regimes that we dislike? I mean, how do we dislike the character? And what do we do if we withdraw? Because that means simply that in that time the Soviets would simply come in. Today it may mean that the Russians or the Chinese come in. Now, how do we balance that? I don't think we found the answer to it.
Well, but it's not. I mean, I don't think this is something that's going to happen in an immediate or neat way. For example, we've spent a lot of time talking about weapons. Every weapons expert I know says that it is not possible for the Saudis to substitute their billions of dollars worth of American, to a lesser extent British arms, with Chinese or Russian.
Because they don't fit.
They don't fit. The systems aren't in place. It's not something that can change overnight. The Chinese, of course, everybody is aware of the Chinese ambitions, the Belt and Road Initiative, ports and the Gulf and East Africa and so on and so forth. But that's a trend rather than something which is going to change in any immediate way.
But Ian, what about this? If or all of you, if all you're doing is buying these weapons, these planes, and just dumping them in the desert, it doesn't really matter whether they work or not. You could simply just leave them there and go out and buy a new lot from a new customer.
We call this defense diplomacy. All the Gulf countries are doing it. They're buying weapons not because they don't have the capacity to actually man them. They don't have the capability to integrate all these different systems together anyway. If you just look at some of these countries, they're buying French, British, and American planes and try to fly them all together. That doesn't work. You know, it's completely inefficient, and they're doing it already. So there is a lot of more leverage, and I think the problem that we have in Europe is that we probably shouldn't be a problem, but it's a problem in the eyes of the Gulf. Is that we still push values, and I think this is something that doesn't go down well with authoritarian autocrats in this part of the world. While China and Russia take a more unconditional support, if you will, and now the Americans have realized that Trump is saying, our support is unconditional as well. For us, values become second to interests. And that's something that goes down very well in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi.
I mean, I'm laughing at you because you, like me, are old enough to remember when in this country we had what the late Robin Cook called an ethical foreign policy. An ethical foreign policy. Now, these days, there's not much pretense that anybody is trying to do that, to make any distinction between values and interests. It's interests that are always preeminent.
To this, because there have been suggestions publicly aired that the killing of Jamal Khashoggi was not the first one either authorized at the very highest level in Saudi Arabia or indeed perhaps carried out in Saudi Arabia. So, do the powers, the military powers, if you like, in Europe, want to see Mohammed bin Salman stay no matter what he's like, or do they want change?
Well, there's an issue here. I mean, we were talking about values and interests. But in a way, the issue now has moved increasingly to the idea that we should be supporting a rules-based order. I mean, if we can't have liberal democracies around the world, then we should at least have some agreed rules that both the autocratic regimes and the democratic powers adhere to. Now, the British government has been making this case increasingly over the last couple of years. So this seems to be one of those issues where the rules clearly have been flouted. You don't kill people and...
So this is a pragmatic foreign policy, is it, rather than...
In a way, but it does have an ethical tinge to it, maybe not to the same degree that we saw in the 1990s, but there's still something there. And to uphold the rules in this, well, what you might say in wider geopolitical terms is a rather limited affair, but still nevertheless a fairly ugly one. This needs to be seen as a kind of a litmus test for the wider order itself.
So is he just going to get away with a slap on the wrist and a reminder not to do this sort of thing in future because we're watching and we could do something?
I mean, what Europe is trying to do is trying to rein Mohammed bin Salman in, and this is, as you rightly say, this is his impulsiveness, him trying. I mean, he's not been groomed to take over that responsibility to lead a country, unlike other princes in the country. He's surrounded himself by people who are supporting his impulsiveness, who are absolutely emotional and irrational, people who have taken a zero-sum approach to everything they do, and this kind of hawkish zero-sum attitude that they show towards dissidents and opposition figures within their own country, that's something they've shown towards Qatar last year, then they've shown it to Lebanon, they've showed it in Yemen, and this is, I think, the key issue here for Europe. They need to understand whether this is someone that you want to rely on as a partner to provide stability in the region, and I think the answer to that is no, but then what alternative do you have?
Is he going to stay, Ian?
All the Saudis I know think that he is going to stay because he has consolidated his power in a very, very complete way, that there are no rival centres of power to challenge him, They don't rule out people who know the system well. They don't rule out, cosmetic measures to show greater consultation and so on and so forth. The British government, for example, very early on in this affair, was keen to promote the idea that they could have a review of the way the intelligence and security systems worked in Saudi Arabia. But who was appointed to head that committee? Mohammed bin Salman himself. So I think everybody understands there are limits to what you can do. I haven't yet come across anybody whose expertise I value who thinks that bin Salman is on the way out because of this affair.
Very quickly, James, to the long-term benefit or detriment of the region and the world as a whole, he will stay.
I think to the long-term detriment, but again, like the others, I cannot see how he will be dethroned from his position at the current time.
Will he be kept in place perhaps just because they wouldn't want to lose face at some point, or will he always be the power?
Well, we can't predict what will happen in the future. I mean, all the time things happen that we simply cannot foresee, but nevertheless, it seems that he's here to stay for the time being.
Fascinating. Listen, thank you all very, very much indeed. It remains to be seen what action will be taken, whether it actually has any effect. But thank you very much for kicking around all of those ideas. And thank you very much for watching. This has been Roundtable from me, David Foster, but more importantly, from the team that pulled all this together and from my guests and to you. Thank you very much. We hope to have your company next time. Bye-bye.